episode 149. Tiffany Yecke Brooks, To Rebehold the Stars. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I am in conversation with Tiffany Yecke Brooks, author of To Rebehold the Stars, a book that doesn't shy away from the hardest questions about faith, silence, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about God. Tiffany invites us into a space where certainty dissolves, where divine silence feels indistinguishable from absence, and where the work of knowing one's authentic self can be both unsettling and necessary. She challenges us to interrogate our assumptions about spirituality, about the body's role in emotion and trauma, about whether mystical experiences require anything supernatural at all. This is a book that pushes us out of our comfort zones, not to destroy faith, but to examine it honestly. I'm grateful to have Tiffany to explore these tensions and to talk about what it means to rebuild meaning from the old frameworks we no longer hold. As always, links to Tiffany's other work and topics we touch on are in the show notes. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is Matthew, and in this episode I'm in conversation with Tiffany Yecke Brooks. We're talking about her book To Rebehold the Stars. Tiffany's written several books. This one is her latest, a very thoughtful and very challenging book. It definitely had me thinking. It definitely had me doing things that as an atheist I did not expect to do. So Tiffany, welcome to Still Unbelievable. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and have a conversation with me. We've had a fun bit of chat about life here in the UK, because apparently you spent some time here in the UK not far from me, so we've had a lovely chat about that. Maybe we know each other a little bit better. But your book, tell me about your book. It's got an intriguing title. How did you get the title, and who do you want to read your book?
Yeah, so the title actually comes from, well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I love that these conversations are happening all over the place. So I really appreciate the invitation. The title of the book is actually the final line from the Inferno. And so it's specifically the translation from 1867 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Dante and Virgil have traversed the 9 circles and climbed down Satan's leg, and they're emerging on the other side of the world in the wee hours of Easter morning. And he says, it was from thence that we emerged to re-behold the stars. And that's how the Inferno ends. And to me, that was such a fascinating moment to think about. Dante has just gone through this harrowing experience. He's seen things that he couldn't have imagined. It's, asked all these questions, had his mind blown, essentially. And then he comes back out, and the thing that greets him, the thing that lets him know that he's out of hell, that he's put that behind him, is he looks up and he just beholds the glories of the heaven, the glory of the heavens, right? He just sees the wonder of creation. He re-beholds the stars. He sees them again with new eyes. And now we know we still have Purgatorio, we still have Paradiso, right? There's still a journey to go. He's at the base of the mountain, but in this moment, he's pausing and he's having a moment of wonder and reflection, and then looking ahead at what comes next. And I thought that really perfectly captured the moment in which a lot of people find themselves right now, that they've gone through the deconstruction process. And now is the moment where they decide what comes next. So I went through all of that, and it changed me. And what do I do now?
Nice. Now, I have obviously heard of Dante's Inferno. I have not read it, I confess, but I've heard several people talk about it, and people who have studied it and read it deeply always seem to speak with it with the kind of enthusiasm that you've just spoken about it. But I don't think I've ever heard anybody link any of the themes in it to deconstruction. Where did you get that from?
Well, I think for a lot of us who have gone through the deconstruction process, it feels like hell. I think especially if you were brought up with hell anxiety, if you were in a high control church where everything had eternal implications, and you were constantly hearing about being at risk of hell, one of the things that you're always warned about was doubt and questioning. And that was a slippery slope, right into the bowels of Satan's realm or whatever. And so I think it's a very apt metaphor for the process that a lot of people go through, that once he when he enters the underworld to go through, each circle takes him lower and lower. And I think that's what the process feels like sometimes, that each question, the more you start to pull at those threads, the more unravels, and the more you see that you have to question. Because for so many people, we never even think to question something, either because we were told you can't question, that's not okay, that's not allowed here, or because we never even thought to question, because as the expression goes, a fish never asks what's water.
Yeah.
Right? When it's just the air you breathe and the soup that you live in, it never even occurs to you that there's something to question. And so once you finally look behind the curtain, so to speak, and take that peek and then start to ask those questions, for a lot of people it can feel like this descent deeper and deeper into heavier and heavier questions. But then you don't stay there. Some people, a lot of people, then emerge on the other side of that and come back up out of that. And some people do that and decide, I've gone through this and faith isn't for me anymore. And other people say, okay, I've gone through this and I still believe there's something worth hanging on to. So what am I going to do about it? Because the thing about deconstruction is, we know that nature abhors a vacuum, right? So if you want to reconstruct something, you need to be intentional about what's going to fill in those holes. The bricks that you've just pulled out, something's going to go in there. And the easiest thing to go in there are those old scripts that you spent so long, years, decades even, deconstructing, that I think it's really important for people to be intentional and be deliberate in this moment of saying, what is going to go back in there? Because I don't want to replace it with the bad theology that I just fought so hard to get rid of. And that doesn't mean either that you just come up with some crazy mental gymnastics answer that you plug in, because I think a lot of us grew up thinking, well, you can't say I don't know, right? Like Jesus wants you to always have the right answer and always say the right thing. But even intentionally saying, I'm going to put a question mark in that hole right now, holds that space so that you don't just plug those old damaging scripts back in. And that's the process that I want people to walk through. And that I think people who are there right now, that's why I really wrote this book for, is to think about how do you go through that process of intentionally choosing what goes into the reconstruction process.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. I've had a few conversations with people and authors about the subject of deconstruction, and everybody says it's a hard process. But you're the first person who said it is so hard, it may as well be Dante's Inferno. You're the first person, I think, who's acknowledged it is that level of visceral discomfort. And I really appreciate you for saying that. And I'm on board with your analogy. Yeah. Yes, I've still not read Dante's Inferno, but I have an idea of what it's about. I've heard people talk about it, and I get it. In the deconstruction communities that I see, the topic of hell comes up an awful lot. The fear of hell is very real. The torment, if I can use that word, that people carry over hell is real. But it's not just that, it's the actual process. Hell, the fear of hell wasn't a feature of my specific deconstruction, but the process that I had to go through, and you were right, it started with the little questions. Can I believe that the Tower of Babel is just a story and not a real thing? Yeah, sure. How does that affect my faith? Well, not much, really. Deconstructing Noah's flood was a little bit more difficult, because that meant that came part of the package of a shift from creationism to evolution. But I could still do that and maintain a faith, but it was a little bit harder. It was next level down. And then you go on and on and on. And then when you get to the point of questioning God, you go, how much worse can this possibly get?
Mm-hmm.
So
something
thank you
I
for
talk
your
about.
analogy. It works.
Oh, thank you. No, I was going to say something that I talk about in my previous book called Holy Ghosted, is that there's a difference between deconstructing faith and deconstructing God. Mm-hmm. And that people will go, their journeys will take them different ways. And for some people, it goes the faith route. And some people, it really goes to deconstructing God. And that those are two very closely related, but slightly different journeys. But the emotional toll that it can take is very similar.
It is very real, and it hurts, and it's hellish. And I've not read Holy Ghosted. I had been aware that Holy Ghosted was around. So when I realised that it was the same author that was coming into my inbox through this book, I was very pleased. I probably should read it, because those who I know who've talked about it have spoken well of it. I certainly feel that if God exists, I was ghosted. So it certainly fits with my experience. So on the title alone and my experience, I feel like it's definitely a book that I should engage with, because that whole experience of being ghosted by God is hard.
Absolutely.
So going back to one of my earlier questions then, who do you want to read your book?
I want it to be anyone who is at the point of considering reconstruction. You don't even necessarily have to be gung-ho in the process of yes, I want to rebuild my faith, but just someone who is open to the idea of, I might be willing to engage with faith again after going through this process. So that's the main demographic for whom I write, is people who are somewhere in that process of considering or actively reconstructing. But what's interesting is I've actually heard from a number of parents of teenagers and youth leaders who are working with young people in their churches being really interested in the book, because they're saying, if we show our young people now that it's okay to ask these questions and go through this process, and that you may have times where your faith feels like it's starting to crumble and you can survive on the other side, they're not going to panic when they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old and suddenly they're starting to question everything. And so I would also encourage anybody who wants to foster that kind of approach to faith with their teenagers or young adults that they might be working with, is to just say, let's talk about this. Because I think for a lot of us, doubt was catastrophized, right? Yeah. Like, it was like, if you have one doubt, then, oh my goodness, like, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. You can't do that. You can't. And so then you think, well, something's wrong with me. And then you close down, and then you just answer the right way instead of the authentic way, like what you're actually thinking. And it just leads to a whole process of developing an inauthentic faith, which is not a true relationship with God, which is supposedly what we're supposed to want in our churches and for our people in faith. And so that's another sort of unexpected group of people that I have found have expressed interest or excitement about the book. And I thought that was encouraging.
That's very interesting, because when I was still a Christian, so we're talking 20, 25 years ago now, I was a youth leader in my church. Okay. And I love doing youth. I love doing teenage work one night a week at the church hall, pretending that I was still cool and hip because all these teenagers enjoyed talking with me. And I did run a couple of, and obviously part of that, there would always be a spiritual element to the evening as well. I don't think we ever dealt with doubt in a way that wasn't superficial and dismissal. And my Christianity at the time was of such, yes, I worked with people who weren't Christians. Yes, I knew people who weren't Christians, but I didn't interact with anybody I knew who had been a Christian, gone through any kind of significant deconstruction process, and remained a Christian. So I had nobody on my radar I could have this kind of conversation with. And also, let's be honest, 20 years ago, the whole deconstruction thing wasn't a thing.
No, and I agree. And that was one of the challenging things for me when I was going through it about 2009, 2010, was I didn't have a word for it, right? Like, I didn't even hear the word deconstruction until probably 2018, 2019. And so the only word I had for it was like faith crisis and doubt, backsliding, you know, all those terms that we throw out and almost pathologize in the faith. And so just if somebody had told me this is normal and this is part of the maturation of your faith, this is a good thing, because what you're coming out with is something that's authentic.
Yeah.
Like that would have made all the difference in the world.
Yes. And I have had opportunities over the last decade to think through this kind of thing and how would my journey have been different if I'd had access to this kind of material. And there have been a couple of books, maybe three, of which yours is now one of them, where I've actually sat down and thought, if I'd had this book in my hands 20 years ago, what difference would it have made? Would it have been... And obviously I don't know the answer to that. It's impossible for me to answer to that. But I think it's a compliment that I even entertained that question, that this book might have made a difference.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. And yeah.
But yeah, and on the whole deconstruction, when I was blogging through my deconstruction, so again, 15 years ago when I was writing it down as a blog, and I wrote a blog post, what do I call this thing that I've done? And so I settled on deconversion. But I didn't like that word because conversion is moving from one belief to another belief. And I said, I'm not doing that. I'm just shedding a belief. I'm not moving to another belief. So I said, is deconversion really the right word? And then, of course, a couple of years later, deconstruction started. I thought, that's the one I should have had.
That's what I was looking for.
that's the one, because it explains it and it covers things up. It allows for people who maintain some kind of faith, as well as the ugly people like me who abandon it altogether. And I like that it covers all of the things. I still use deconverted to describe myself, but I think deconstruction gives a good image of what you have to go through. And I think if both believers and non-believers can at least hold hands over that journey, it creates something that we can actually be friends over. And it's that cross the aisle thinking. And I think if we separate our journeys to those who kept it and those horrible ones who didn't, it creates a bipartisan scenario, which I think is very unhelpful to both ways of conversation.
Completely agree.
Okay, thank you. So one of the first things that did, actually no, before I get to that, you've made the mention to it or reference to it. You have got some notes and some exercises in your book, and I think again yours is about the third or the fourth book on this topic where there's been exercises and notes and things, and each one has got more and more in depth, more and more sharp, more and more challenging, and yours is definitely by a long way the hardest one to get through in terms of going through those notes. And I reckon if I'd gone through all of them, I'd have spent more time doing those exercises than I did reading your book. And I kind of got the impression you intended that.
Very much, yes. Like I want people to obviously kind of read and understand what the purpose of these exercises are and what the aim is. But the whole point, I think, for most people who are at this stage of rebuilding their faith is that we don't want to have somebody else telling us what our faith has to look like.
Yeah.
We just went through that. Like that's not what this is about. This is about listening to how were we created to resonate with God? How was our soul uniquely crafted to receive God and to love God and neighbor? And I try to make the point in the book that this isn't creating God in our own image, but it is paying attention to how we were created and then allowing our soul to respond to that and then live out our belief in accordance with that. I use the example of if you were trying to have a special day to bond with your kid, for example, and say you have a child who does not like arts and crafts, they're not your crafty kid, you probably would not go to a pottery studio and spend the day together, right? Like that's not going to, that's not going to connect.
My daughter would love me forever if I did that, but so wrong example, but I know where you're going.
Right. Or if you have a child who maybe doesn't like loud crowds, you're not going to take them to an athletic event as an attempt to bond.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important way to think about this process as well, is if we're trying to build a relationship with God. So many of us have been dictated to of this is what faith must look like. This is what worship must look like. And maybe that's not how we feel God or sense God or see God. And so what if we learn how God created us to receive God? Wouldn't that change everything?
I love that you've done that, and it's perfectly on point because the last interview that I did is an episode going to go live. It's the one immediately before yours. So by the time my listeners are listening to this, they will have already heard my interview with James McGrath a couple of weeks ago. And he makes the same point. His intention in writing his book, Beyond Deconversion, or rather Beyond Deconstruction, was not to tell people what they should believe, but to try to give them some tools and give them some methodologies to find what is the best for them.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so what I would like to say to listeners, Tiffany's book is lovely. She writes well, she writes beautifully, she writes encouragingly, and she writes lovingly. So if you want to read a book that's good for that, go and buy it. But do be warned and do come with the knowledge that in reading that book there are some heavy exercises that Tiffany asks of you to do. And so if you're in a deconstruction space where you're not sure what to do about the God question, if you're not sure what to do about aspects of the character of God, this is probably the right book for you, because it will take you down paths and avenues that you didn't expect to go down. It will make you think through and it will challenge you. And Tiffany does quite a few interesting things. It's almost as though she's got a psychology degree or something related, because she really does take you on this journey through various, I've already said exercises, but that is what she does. I don't want to give it all away. I'll let Tiffany tell us a little bit about those in a minute. But there really is a lot of cognitive function that's going to be required of you as part of reading this book. And I do recommend it if you're trying to work things out, because you won't find an answer just by reading. You'll only get what's right for you by working things out. And Tiffany's book does guide you through a process that will definitely help. So Tiffany, with those exercises, give my listeners some kind of expectation. What are they going to be challenged to do? And why have you given these kind of challenges in your book?
So, as a little bit of background about me, my other life besides being an author is as a literature and writing professor, and so I am a language person, and so I always, all of my books, I approach faith from a lens of language and what do we do with it? Either how is language twisted to manipulate people in a harmful way, and what can you do about that? But in this case, I wanted to look at how do we build a new spiritual lexicon for ourselves? How do we either re-examine old words that, there are those certain churchy words that we just throw around, like, righteousness or, mercy, whatever, whatever these things are, salvation, that we just sort of say in a church context and we absorb all these meanings from, but we never necessarily think about exactly what they mean. And so that's one of the things I do in the book is look at some of those churchy words and look at what they originally signify in the Hebrew or the Greek in the broader way, and then try to look at them through new eyes. But more broadly is I want to give readers a toolkit for creating a new spiritual lexicon for themselves. So, for example, many of us have an image of God that we were given, either what we picture or, things that were listed in the Bible of this is how you picture God. And so I have some exercises that we do to think of how do we think of new images of God. And I want to specify that when I say language, I don't just mean words. I mean words and images and metaphors and the way we incorporate experiences and impressions and emotions and all of these things, both verbal and nonverbal, that contribute to the language, broadly defined, that we use to understand the divine. And so, one of the things that I do is talk about jamais vu, which is the opposite of déjà vu. Déjà vu, obviously being the thing that you've never experienced before, but it feels familiar. Jamais vu means seeing something that you've seen a million times, but suddenly it appears new. And to me, that's kind of a key concept for what we're doing here, is because for people, especially people who are raised in the faith, there are so many words and ideas that we are so used to that it's difficult to think how we could see them with new eyes. and maybe through new eyes, a new appreciation or a different appreciation for what they could actually be saying for us. And so we do some exercises to sort of remystify the faith for ourselves, so that when we look at scripture, when we think about God, the words and ideas and metaphors are fresh and they strike us in different ways, and the significance behind them comes to us in a new way. Something I talk about is, a very common image of God we hear is the Lion of Judah, which that's great. Sure, if you live in a place where wild lions roam the landscape, as the writer would have experienced. But for those of us in the West, if the only lion that you see is the one that sleeps 20 hours a day at the zoo, that's not that majestic, right? Like, we put lions on baby onesies and stuffed animals. Like, the concept of a lion is not really that impressive in our society. But what's the idea behind it? Is it strength? Is it, this loud voice that can be heard forever? Is it, pride? Is it what? Or maybe that idea bothers you because it's predatory, because you're scared of it. But if that's the image that you were given of God to understand, then that in itself can be limiting. So one thing I do, I have 50 sort of unconventional images of God that are listed, that they all appear in scripture. Like, God is a mother bear in Hosea, right? Completely. And Mama Bear, that's even an expression, that protective instinct. And I had just always read past that or never really registered that. So one thing is just a list of other images of God that we usually don't hear from the pulpit. A woman in labor, for example. But then we also do some exercises to help you kind of pull together the verbal left hemisphere of the brain and the more abstract right hemisphere of the brain. I know that's a gross simplification of neurology there, but we get the idea of the right brain, left brain, to kind of pull that in harmony and write about the ideas behind that contribute to the image of God. And so, have exercises of how you can kind of tap into that right brain side a little more, where you work with the impressions. And then I encourage readers to just look at that and go through and see what makes sense. And I confess that I had sort of a silly one when I did that the first time, which was, to me, God was cake. And it works because, like I said, first of all, I really, really love cake. And so, like, hey, that's cool. But there's also this idea of, what's behind what I was taught about God. And so thinking, well, God is mysterious. I don't really know what God is. So when I look at the flour and the sugar and the eggs and the milk, somehow those magically combine into something that forms a cake. I don't get the chemistry. I didn't see where the wheat was milled in Kansas, whatever. But I trust that when I put those things together, they create something wonderful. And then Jesus, as the incarnation, like, that is the cake. That's the tangible thing that results, that I can touch and feel. And then the Holy Spirit, the smell that fills the air as the cake bakes, or even the frosting that you put on the outside that tells you what you're celebrating with this cake. And for me, that was just a new way of thinking about the different aspects of God that was still true to what I believe the essence of God is, but it wasn't cliched or tired. It forced me to think about how I understood God in new terms, which for me was really helpful in then making sense of my relationship to God, because I understood how I pictured God better.
So I guess one obvious thought, and this comes from my Christian background, which was very much a fundamentalist, literalist Christian background, and my memories of that experience is automatically going, and I did have that reading through your book, but I do love that Christians are exploring change and difference and nuance. If you're letting people believe what they would rather believe and ditch the beliefs that are difficult for them, aren't you just letting them have a pick and mix style of Christianity? And isn't that the opposite of Jesus?
Well, so I would say two things. First of all, we all pick and mix. Everybody cherry picks, unless you are. Yeah. So like, let's just put that one out there first. But I would say this is not pick what's easy and what you like and ignore what's hard. I actually see it. One of the things that I say throughout the book is we should be holding each belief up to the heart of God and determining, does this align or not? Um, and part of that is recognizing when we have been a part of systems that have harmed people. And that's where I'd say that it's not all easygoing and the fun parts of faith. Is some of that is having to look and say, where have I contributed to systemic harm? What beliefs have I held that have hurt people, that have caused real damage to someone else? And what do I do about that? What can I do about that? Is there a way to make amends? How do I ask for forgiveness? How do I forgive myself? How do I move forward, not just doing better, but trying to make up for hurt that I may have caused in the past? And that's really incredibly uncomfortable. And that's actually the part of faith that I think a lot of evangelical Christians, fundamentalist Christians right now are not participating in, because the beliefs that so many of I come from a fundamentalist tradition as well. And the beliefs that so many of them are propping up are the ones that keep them in power, are the ones that are comfortable and convenient to them, are the ones, they have a God who conveniently looks a lot like the guy in the pulpit. And it is always a guy in the pulpit.
Yes. Yes,
right?
it is.
And so what I challenge believers to do, or seekers to do, is to think about, what are those parts of faith that I was complicit in? And that's a really difficult, sobering part of the process of having to reconcile past beliefs and who we were in the past. I saw something on social media recently that said, please forgive me for what I said when I was an evangelical teenager. And it just kind of made me laugh, because I was like, ooh, that strikes a little close to home, because I can think of some things I said and things I believed and ways I acted that I'm horrified by now. But I know that 16-year-old would also be looking 30 years in the future and be horrified at who I am right now, saying, but you don't believe this, but you let go of that. But that's part of this process, is that we are allowing God to become bigger than we were ever allowed to let God be, if that makes sense. We were given a God with very strict parameters. And if we recognize that maybe those parameters are man-made, and maybe God is much bigger than what we were taught was all we could see, doesn't that open up so much more possibility for love and for goodness and for living out your faith in the world?
Thank you for that. You have a beautiful chapter on forgiveness. It goes towards the end of the book, but since you've been talking about that, let's sit on that for a short bit. I do like that you've placed it after the reader has gone through a lot of hard work. I think it's right, and I think it's appropriate that you've made them do all that hard work before you land on your forgiveness chapter, and we don't need to justify that. I had I'm going to get a little bit personal for a bit. I had an experience not long ago where somebody who I've known for more than 20 years, who's a trans female, and so we first knew each other, got to know each other when I was still a slightly fundy Christian, and I hosted her here in an episode of Still Unbelievable last year. And I had an opportunity to say something along the lines of what you just said. I'm sorry for the things that I said and did when I was a Christian. And I didn't do it on the recording for any kind of credit to myself. I did it because I felt it was something that I needed to do. And it was a great moment, but it was very emotional. She was very gracious, but I found that, and as you hinted at in your book, the release for me, verbalizing my need for forgiveness, was actually immense, and it had a greater positive joy in me than I thought it was going to.
That's beautiful.
So the flip side of that is, I've talked in several episodes on Still Unbelievable about the relationship I have with my father, and it's a complex relationship. It's been a difficult relationship ever since I was a preteen and my parents separated and ultimately divorced. To the point where I've now gone no contact with my father. But the phrase that I've used in the past about what, because of the fundamentalist Christianity I had as a 9-year-old, my parents separating, I took all that rigid, fundamental, man must be with a woman forever and never the twain shall part, and this separation of my parents that was becoming very painful and very traumatic, and I put all of that fundamentalism into that trauma and pain, and the result was a forever fractured relationship with my father. So I have said the words on more than one occasion, I can never forgive Christianity for doing that to me. So how does that forgiveness work when the object of your pain, the object that you're withholding forgiveness from, is not an individual that you can have a conversation with?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those really difficult questions, that one of the hard things that is required if you want to be honest about your faith and not just spiritually bypass with a little shrug and let's talk about something else. I do have a section in the forgiveness chapter where I talk about forgiving God. And what does that look like? And we're not supposed to talk about it, right? Like you're not supposed to even say that you could feel that way. And what I discuss there is the idea of in any relationship, a misalignment of expectations is going to result in conflict. Yep. That's going to result in a rift. And so something that I suggest readers do is to make a list of what their expectations are of God or of the church or of their faith, and then look at that and ask yourself, which of these were you explicitly taught? Which of these did you kind of just absorb by living in it? And which of these, is just something that you wish was true? And then in looking at those things, I don't know, it's sort of the opposite of like the name it and claim it gospel, or that kind of theology. Like you don't have to put hard parameters on it, but you just have to be open to the possibility that there could be reconciliation if that is what you want. And that's something I stress in the chapter, is that you may not want reconciliation. But I think so often forgiveness has been defined and abused in Christianity as sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened, right? And so in 1 Corinthians 13, we have, well, love keeps no record of wrong. So you're in the wrong if you're still carrying a grudge. But we never read the second part of that verse, which is love keeps no record of wrong, but rejoices in the truth. Sometimes part of forgiveness is truth telling.
Yeah.
And rather than sweeping it under the rug, it's speaking out and saying what was wrong, what was committed against you, and acknowledging that. That's when forgiveness you can open the door for forgiveness to take place. And something else that I point out is that the verb athemi, which is used in the Greek, it's the word most commonly used for forgiveness, actually means to send away. And it's the same verb that Paul uses when he talks about divorce, that it means a separation from. And so sometimes forgiveness can mean that we separate ourselves from the party that harmed us. And, it seems like, in your case, that was the church. And that may be necessary. There may be a need. I would always encourage people that if they're in a toxic environment that's harming them, to leave that. That is okay. Like, God cares about your healthiness just as much as God cares about your holiness or happiness. And that's something actually in my first book that I called Gaslighted by God that I talk about quite a bit, is there was a social media meme a couple of years ago that said, God cares more about your holiness than your happiness. And I thought, okay, but I think God cares more about your healthiness than any of that, because we see time and again Jesus saying, if you had a kid or an ox who fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't you save them? Here's a person with a withered hand. I'm going to save them on the Sabbath. I don't care that you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. I care about this human life. I care about this important thing more than I care about the legalism. That's not what this was ever supposed to be about. And so we see Jesus living that out. And that to me is so beautiful, to think God cares about my health. God cares if my mental health is being damaged in the church. That's okay if you need to step away. If your church is harming you, or if your religion, if your faith is making you a worse person, you probably don't need to be practicing that faith. And you can step away, and maybe you find your way back. I mean, I would hope you would, if you could find your way to a healthy environment. But I certainly don't think God will want you to reinsert yourself into a toxic environment that was, harming you just because got to be in church. And so I think it requires a shift in our understanding of what our expectations of God are, and what also, conversely, what God expects of us. And I think God expects us to be seeking health and safety for ourselves and the people around us, just as much as, any kind of dogma or doctrine.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. Again, you've sparked off memories of me going to, when I used to go to church regularly 20 years ago. And again, one of the regular conversations we had when we were in a church where there was a bit of a toxic environment and people were starting to leave the church, people who'd been there for a while. And the number of conversations we had with friends who were still attendees: when is it right to leave a church? I'm not happy here. You're not happy here. But our friends are here. But our friends are also at that church. We're still ministering in this church. There's still people we can minister in this church. We could do that in that church. And we're unhappy. When is it good to leave? But when you're just leaving, aren't you just hopping? Aren't you supposed to work through and change from the inside and make it better? And the knots that we used to tie each other in,
Yes.
Having this kind of conversation, I don't think anybody ever said, but what's best for you? It was all about what we could do, who we could serve, who we could help.
And the more you, right, like the whole Jesus, others, yourself, and that's how you get joy in your life, JOY, that's the acronym. It's always about putting yourself last and, debasing yourself to some degree. But if you think about it, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. Loving yourself, Jesus takes that as a given, that's part of the equation, that you should be loving yourself. And that's an essential part of what all of this is supposed to be about.
Thank you for that. So let's move on back to the beginning of your book, then, because you've talked about Holy Ghosted a couple of times. Oh, am I actually about to get to a question that I've sent you? This is how these things go. I always send notes. I always send questions, and the number of times I end up just talking and having a wonderful conversation anyway. But at least the guest has an idea of what I got from their book anyway. But early in the book, you talk about silence from God, chapter 3, I think it is. And you've already mentioned your previous book, Holy Ghosted, which apparently I should read. So one of the things that is a big feature of my thinking, and has been for quite a long time through my deconstruction, is when you're feeling silence from God, when you're feeling that God is ghosting you, and you're praying on your knees and you're in that shadow of doubt, and you're begging God for a response or something, just anything to help you have a bit of faith, and the silence is just mind-numbingly awful. At what point can you ask yourself the question, maybe God isn't there? Or, to be more blunt about it, what's the difference between a God that won't talk to you and a God that doesn't exist?
And I think that's such an important question. And I think the answer is kind of multifaceted. For one thing, you can't really know that difference. And really, I think that's where it comes to learning to listen to your soul. I remember when I was struggling at one point, I got angry and said, you know what? I'm not going to believe in you anymore. And I immediately started laughing because I was like, I'm telling something that I'm not going to believe it. Like how I sound like a child, Yes. But there was this sense of like, okay, God, it's up to you to reveal yourself. Mm-hmm. I can't keep chasing right now. And so I think some of it is just opening yourself up to, like, do you sense, is there still something there, or is there emptiness? And just being honest about what you feel. If it's okay, if we jump ahead to one of your other questions that I think also kind of touches on this, where you said, how do you differentiate between an unanswered prayer and the answer of anyone to that absence of anyone to answer it? Because I think it goes along with this.
Yeah.
And I would say that, to me, it depends on what you believe the purpose of prayer is.
Mm-hmm.
That if it's only to get a specific outcome or to manipulate events, then maybe you aren't praying so much as you're actually trying to practice magic of some kind,
Yes.
right? But because in that case, there is no difference if the outcome is the same answer either way, which is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you believe that prayer is a kind of a spiritual, verbal processing that can help you reason through or can help you make sense of your emotions, and there's a huge difference, because that's building a relationship with the listener, as opposed to just screaming into the proverbial void or trying to manipulate the outcome. And so I'd say all of that sort of comes together to say it's called faith because we can't know.
Yeah.
Right. And so really, I think to some degree there's an element of choice of, I don't feel it right now, but I'm going to choose to continue to believe, or I'm going to remain open to the possibility that something real could be there, that there is a higher power, and to just leave yourself open to that. If that's the most you can offer, then that's the most you can offer, and that's fine. Like, rather than pretending, faking a faith, which a lot of us, again, have had to do at various points, because we know what the right answer is. And, we get patted on the head when we give the right Sunday school answer, as opposed to the actual authentic thing of saying, I don't know, but I am open to God showing God's self. I'm open to the possibility of my soul being stirred to believe there's something more. And if that's what you have to offer, then I think God would rather have something authentic than something imaginary, something pretend.
I actually heard an apologist on a podcast only today use the phrase "fake it till you make it."
Yes.
And I can't tell you how much disdain I have for that phrase. It just doesn't work for me.
Mm-hmm. Nope.
Nope. It just. Anyway, but that's a danger of a Matthew rant. So let's not go there. But no, it's definitely a roll eyes moment, which is a conversation that we had earlier, I think, before yes. I pressed record. So yeah, I went through and past that in my own journey, and it was my wife who said it, not me, about Matthew probably needs a Damascus Road event, because nothing else will get him there. And I think that's probably very true. I went through 3 years of doing what you've just done on my own, in silence, in pain, crying myself to sleep many, many nights, trying to find this openness, and it just wasn't there. So I don't know what can change. Yeah, I'm definitely not closed, but I'm not going to go looking. I think I've gone past the looking point. It's like if you've got an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend who's ghosted you, but you still have a little bit of tenderness there. Chasing after them isn't actually going to achieve anything.
Yes, and so I was glad you brought up the Damascus Road thing, because I actually do talk about that a bit in the book, that there are those Damascus Road moments, and then where just suddenly it's a whole mystical experience, and the scales fall from the eyes, and there's a smoke machine, and laser light show. But then there's also the road to Emmaus, where Jesus is quietly in disguise, and they don't even recognize that Jesus has been with them the whole time. And that's a whole other revelation. But then there's also Gethsemane, and Jesus is in the garden, and he's praying, and he's saying, God, let this cup pass. And he doesn't get anything. He doesn't get an answer. He doesn't get okay. He gets friends who fall asleep. He gets a friend who betrays him. So Jesus was there and experienced the unanswered prayers as well. And, I don't have a neat and clean answer to what we do with that, except to say the scriptures show us that it's not a reflection on you. That if Jesus himself can experience a period of unanswered prayers, it's not about you being closed off or, some hidden sin in your life that's preventing it. It just means that sometimes that's how it is, and it's awful.
Yeah, it is. Let's flip to the other side of that then. The opposite of silence is huge drama. And you talk a little bit about religious experiences, etc. So again, like every good fundy Christian, I've got my own experience that I can relate to. The trouble is, the experience I had was after a deliverance experience. I then had an experience in my bed a couple of weeks later of waking up in the dark, feeling like I had a demon compressing my chest. I couldn't move. I was struggling for breath, and suddenly I was able to gasp out the name of God, and then suddenly everything was clear. It was gone, and I sat up in bed, and the moment was over, etc. And over the years, I've discovered that lots of people have got experiences similar, and then I discover actually this is a well-known psychological event known as sleep paralysis. People have it. It is absolutely petrifyingly scary. Everybody who has it says it's a really frightening experience, and almost everybody who has one interprets it in the eyes of whatever religion or spirituality they're a part of. Again, it's all psychological, and there's no real way that you can actually tie that to a spiritual event. It is a known psychotic event, and we just interpret it differently. So isn't there a danger then that, and because that event helped me to shed my belief in God, because once I discovered that this core event of mine that I'd used as a pillar to bind my faith to was actually fully explained naturally, suddenly what I had left to bind my faith to was nothing. Right. And I think if I had not had that and had a more nuanced faith, I wouldn't have tied everything to one post. And I think that's what you're trying to get in your book. Embrace the nuance, spread your roots, you'll find more grace and more gratitude there. But so the danger, again, of the opposite end of silence is we tie everything to all these big dramas, and then suddenly realize, actually, these are built on sand.
I mean, and I think we all know the little old lady at church who was like, well, God just looked out for me and he showed me a parking spot when I prayed for it. And I'm like, okay, Linda, that's really was at the top of, you know what? And maybe God did. I'm not going to, but that's not necessarily how I'm going to point to evidence of a higher power in the world, because, there was an open parking spot at the Piggly Wiggly when it was raining and I need, So I think you bring up such an important point that when we view everything in life through a lens of heaven or hell, spirituality or, nothingness, whatever that, when we make the stakes so high for everything, sort of the idea of when everything is special, nothing is special. When we run the risk of just over spiritualizing things because we are just constantly like trying to assign spiritual significance to whatever happened. I would encourage you to, like, if it felt like a spiritual experience, fantastic. That is great. If it didn't, fantastic. That is great. The point is, were you better in the end? Did you leave that experience having learned something, having felt better, whatever that is? A theme I try to repeat in the book is, again, if your faith is making you worse, then maybe that's not the right faith. Maybe that's not what your faith is supposed to look like. And so if it's something that happened and it deepened your belief, that is beautiful. That is wonderful. If it's something that's happened and you chalk it up to psychological stuff, awesome. That's amazing. Isn't that incredible, the way our brains were created or developed? I'm not I'm not going to tell you what you have to believe there. No one should. And that's, again, what I'm trying to get at is a lot of us were brought up to believe that trusting your gut is akin to trusting in the flesh.
Yeah.
Right. And so that makes for an environment ripe for abuse. Because if it's, you can't trust yourself, you can only trust me, you can only trust the message I give you, then so many people, and I'm going to say especially women, are taught to choke down intuition, the inner knowing, just having a sense of confidence and, being told, well, this doesn't feel right. I don't think this is okay. But the preacher says it is, or, the spiritual authority says it is, and I'm supposed to be subject to them. And so that's part of this process, I would say, of learning to listen to yourself and how, what I believe is God or the Holy Spirit stirring your soul and saying, did this resonate? Do I think this had spiritual overtones? Yeah. Or no, it's cool that it happened, but not necessarily. And just listening to yourself. Yeah.
And I think being able to be that, if I dare use the word, nonchalant about these experiences is a healthy place to be. And I think what the fundamentalist Christianity that I was a part of, the big mistake that it made, as we've already said, is put so much weight on things that as soon as you take away a little bit of strength, the whole house of cards collapses. And I know there are people out there, apologists out there, who say, I just had the wrong Christianity. If I'd only had the right Christianity, I'd still be a Christian. That might be true. The fact of the matter is, that's the Christianity I was taught, and this is where I am now.
Yep.
And I've been in places where I've seen people struggling with their faith, as you described it. I've been as part of a prayer group where there were people asking for prayer with their faith, and you could see that they were struggling to the point where it was actually almost a torment to them, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know where God was in their lives. They didn't understand why they were struggling so much. They just wanted to have less difficulty doing it, and we were doing our best to pray comfort to them. But I was not mature enough then to recognize that maybe the picture was actually bigger than that. It wasn't them that was the problem. It was the church environment they were in, which was feeding a problem.
Yes. And I think it's so important to remember, we hear, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness.
Yeah.
Seek, that is a verb, that is active. That means that if the kingdom of God is not apparent where you are, maybe you go and look for it somewhere else. Because there are certainly churches where I'm not sure God's hanging around that church. And so if that's the environment that you find yourself in, and it's damaging and it's toxic and it's harming you, seek God somewhere else. That is what you're called to do. Like, that's a good thing.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. And on the subject of that, you do have in one of your chapters, you have that church words list. I think you mentioned to it earlier. This is just an aside. You don't have to comment specifically on it. But I think it tells you about where I am. And I was reading through that list of church words, and I'll confess, I had a negative reaction to almost every single one of them. And it was reading through that list. I mean, I always knew I didn't enjoy church. I do go occasionally. I've got a deal with my wife. She still preaches sometimes at her local church. So I do go occasionally. Occasionally it's even Christmas when I'll go. And we have had conversations about that, because I've always known I had an issue with songs and hymns and worship songs and hymns, because I was big into that. So I've gone the opposite way. I have a really visceral reaction to hearing worship music now. I just can't control it. And I think it's a feature of how deep I went into it when I was a Christian. But reading through your list of church words, they were lighter than that. You weren't asking me to sing a worship song. And as I went through your exercise, thinking of them, I thought, wow, I really don't like church. And it was a really interesting experience. I think it woke me up to how deep my instinctual negative response to church. I can't explain it. All I can do is acknowledge that I now realize that it's actually there, and it's actually quite deep.
Well, I think that maybe is a great example, or a way to kind of discuss specifically one of the exercises in the book, which is where we do some somatic mapping. So the first thing that I do, there's a just kind of like an outline of a human shape. And this is based on a 2014 study from the University of Alto, where they surveyed over 700 people just cross demographically all over the globe. And they found that humans physically experience emotions in different parts of their bodies, and that there was some degree of consistency to that. Again, like cross demographically, which is fascinating. So, what I ask readers to do is I list about 25 different emotions, and I say just sit with that and think about where you feel that emotion in your body and mark it on that little body map. Um, and so you go through that and you just, people will say like depression feels like a numbness or a coldness in the arms and legs, or something is sadness often is activated in the head, obviously because tears, right? So things like that. Where do you experience that emotion in your body? And then we look at that list of church words that you mentioned, and you have a fresh body map, and you read each church word and inhabit what your somatic response is to hearing that word, and mark where you feel that in your body. And then you put those two maps side by side to recognize, is there correlation? And the example that I use, this happened the very first time I did this when I taught a class, was I had a student who said, the word evangelism always made me really uncomfortable. I hated that word and I never knew why. He said, I felt a tightness in my throat. And he said, now I realize that I feel shame as a tightness in my throat. And like, I need to swallow when I feel shame. And that the emotion that I felt when I heard the word evangelism was shame. And I never made that correlation before. I just knew evangelism, made me feel icky, but I didn't know specifically what it was. And I think this is such a helpful exercise for people, because it's kind of that Rumpelstiltskin effect. If you don't know the name of something, you can't defeat it. But once you say, like, I may not know what to do about, just that amorphous, weird feeling, but I do know what to do about shame, or I do know what to do about sadness. And so if you can give it a name, it loses some of its power over you. And I think that's a really important step for healing our relationship with these words and with these concepts that are so closely linked to religion. That if you can recognize what it is about these words that is off-putting, that makes you feel uncomfortable, maybe it then jogs a specific memory that tells you why you have a negative response to that. Or it just unlocks that's how I feel about that, right? It gives you the language to then realize what this ghost that was rattling its chains in the back of your head, what it really is. And it's not some big scary thing. It's an emotion that and you experience. And now you know maybe what to do about it, or you can at least recognize it for what it is.
Thank you for that clarity. And listeners, I hope you got something out of that explanation that Tiffany's just gone. Obviously, because of the context of reading your book, I went through those exercises more quickly than is ideal. But I absolutely do have the intention of going back to them, because I recognise what you were saying, and I recognise there is actually value in going through that, even for somebody as hard-hearted as myself. So I will go and do that, and I'll do that again, because I probably need to do that, because I got to the end of that and I just wrote in my comments really bad negative reaction to those church words, but I didn't sit long enough to be able to make the identification along the lines of what you've just done. So probably just for my own information as much as anything else,
Sure.
I need to go back and do that and see where they land. It might not be shame, but it might be somewhere else interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But on the question, and listeners, there is a link in the show notes to that Alto study. You don't need to start writing notes and do your Google searches. Link in the show notes. I've already done that search for you, so you can find that there. Go and read that. I did have a thought, though, about that study, because that study was linking emotions to physicality. So because of the journey, and I like to think things through scientifically, the obvious question came to me was, doesn't that just show that emotions are physical? there's nothing in this explanation that tells me that I can take the supernatural realm any more seriously than I already do.
I mean, I would say, like, why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Or almost that's kind of a false binary in a way of saying if it's physical, it can't be spiritual, or if it's spiritual, it can't be physical. I think, I mean, to quote a very famous series of books whose author we will not name, one character asks whether something was real or all in his head, and the answer is, he says, "Of course, it's happening in your head, but why should that not mean it's real?" And I think that if it impacted you in a way that led you to find, as I said, led you to find spiritual experience in it or significance in it, that's great. But there's no need to force it. Part of being created in the image of God is having emotions, right? Like, it's impossible, especially the Old Testament, it's impossible to read the Bible and think of God as devoid of emotions. I believe part of the way that humans are the imago Dei, that we do bear the image of God, is that we do have complex emotions. And so I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive simply because it's experienced in the body or it's experienced in the soul.
Thank you for that. I'm going to use that as a springboard just to get to one more thing. I don't want to go through all of your book. I want listeners to go and buy your book, give you a bit of income, and appreciate the book for what it is. So let's not cover the whole book. So I'd just like to land, before we start winding up, on one more topic that you talk about, which I think comes down neatly from what you've just said, and that is embracing the mystical as part of spirituality. You clearly are very comfortable doing that. And I think it's possibly, I have difficulty with that. I'll be straight up and honest about it. And it may be because of my history with the fundamentalist Christianity, but I just don't engage with a God of mystery. Because for me, if it's mystery, if it's mystical, if it can't be known, then it may as well not exist, because I can't explore it and I can't relate to it. So now's your opportunity to sell that to me. Why should my listeners, why should hard-nosed Matthew sat here, why should we soften our hearts towards the mystical? Why should we see treasure in the mystical?
So I will say, I also, coming from a fundamentalist background, I sort of have some Newtonian physics going on here of, to every reaction or to every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. So I also came from this very, logical God. And this is, maybe the pendulum swung the other way, that I'm much more open to the mystical. But one of the early chapters of the book, I talk about just the idea of wonder. And just opening ourselves up to wonder, because so many of us who grew up in regimented faiths, we were closed off to wonder, because we always had to have answers. We always had to know. We always had to be right. And so that letting go of the need to be right and to simply be, and to allow yourself to say, I think God could be bigger than I imagine. I think God could be so much more than I imagine. Opening yourself up to wonder, to allow yourself to say, okay, I can be surprised by God. I can accept that God is bigger than I think. I quote Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he says an object of wonder becomes an object of seeking. That, in other words, like, if you already possess something, there's no need to seek for it. If you already have the answers, you don't need to keep looking, right? But we're called to, faith is supposed to be a journey. And we're supposed to be continually growing. And so, to me, to open yourself up to the mystical, to say, I fully accept that, I have the tiny amount of God, of, this whole bigger, beyond my imagination of what could possibly be. And I just have this tiny little bit that I can see. That allows me to keep pursuing. That makes me want to keep seeking, because there's so much more there than, I say in the book, I talk about people who view God almost like a Rubik's Cube, that you solve the puzzle, right? And then you put it on the shelf and nobody touch it. Because if you get the squares out of order, well, it won't make sense again. But I don't want a Rubik's Cube God. I want a God that I don't put on the shelf and then take down and turn and admire how I solved God, right? Like I have the answers. I figured God out. Me and all of human history, I'm the one who got it right. Right? There's such an arrogance that comes with, and I'm sorry, I don't mean that as I'm not calling you arrogant, but I mean that faith often teaches us an arrogance of believing that we understand God, that we can hold God. And so I think that just, again, allowing yourself to be open to the possibility of wonder, to me, makes for so much more of a beautiful, meaningful life. Because I choose to believe, because I want to believe that to borrow a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., well, to adapt it, that the long arc of the universe bends toward redemption. He said justice, but I think that idea is there. I want to believe that the long arc of the universe bends toward redemption, and that whatever good we do, whatever love we put in the world, means something. I don't have to know what it means. But to me, that makes existence much more beautiful than just believing it's all accident and chaos. To believe that we are headed somewhere, and that somewhere is beautiful and redemptive and inclusive and healed, that creation is healed. That to me is the most beautiful thing that I can imagine. And so that's why I choose to believe. That's why I think having the possibility of wonder is worth it, is because it means that we're headed somewhere, and I don't have to know where, but I just know that the good that I do, the love that I put in the world, isn't wasted.
The journey, not the destination.
Absolutely.
Would you say then that you see an equivalent pleasure in working out mysteries or discovering mysteries of God to working out and discovering mysteries of science?
I think I absolutely see God in science. I mean, to me, it's impossible for me to look at, say, something like DNA or to, quantum physics, and to think that this was all accident. I believe that there is design in it. I don't think it happened in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. But I believe that there is an order to it, and that there is something underlying all of creation. And so to me, science is absolutely a part of God.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Is there anything more that you'd like me or my listeners to know before we start winding up?
I just want to say that I think it's wonderful that you have this podcast, that you have listeners who are having these difficult conversations, who are going through these difficult processes, and are willing to be honest about it, and are willing to deal with the pain that comes with it. You can lose community, you lose certainty. There is a lot of loss tied up in this process.
There is.
But to do that bravely and to do that honestly is profound. And I want to acknowledge that and honor that, because it's not easy. And just to say, I understand that pain of the crying, sometimes for years, and sitting in the silence. And I just hope that this book can hopefully be a companion for somebody who's there and is looking for just a kind voice to come beside them in that moment.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I do appreciate that. The number of Christians who do get it like you are sadly outnumbered by the vast number of Christians who don't get it. So it is truly beautiful to me to hear you say and acknowledge that, and I hope my listeners feel the same. Tiffany, you're a lovely individual. You have a beautiful name. I have a cousin called Tiffany, and I love your effervescence. You talk enthusiastically about this. It's been great seeing you on video. If you ever are here in the West Country of the UK ever again, please do look me up. It will be a pleasure to buy you a drink. You are indeed a precious individual. I've really enjoyed having this conversation. So in order to wind up, as is usual, do you have a favourite Bible character, and who is it?
So I'd have to say, usually, I have to admit that my answer is JL. Love the tent peg story, But right now,
Well,
I
that's
currently,
dark, that is.
yeah, I know. But you talk about biblical womanhood.
Yep.
JL's a biblical woman too.
Yep.
But I have to say, right now, I'm feeling a lot of resonance with Vashti, because you look at the book of Esther, and Esther is being held up as she's the woman who we should all strive to be like. But Vashti is the woman, the first wife, who said, no, I'm not showing up to your drunken party. I'm not putting myself on display. Vashti had agency, and she stood her ground, and she was cast out of the palace for it. And I think it really is important for us, especially with things that are going on in the world right now, to acknowledge people who have spoken up and said no to exploitation, who have said no to abuse, who have said no to people who want to do disgusting things. And I think that we really need to acknowledge those figures and recognize the pain that they experience of being cast out or being dragged through the mud, but what incredible bravery that takes.
Thank you for that. Can I make reference then to a certain awesome gold-winning female hockey team?
Yes, absolutely, always.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you once.
Fantastic.
Thank you once more, Tiffany. You've been wonderful. And until next time. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.